we welcome to the show Steve Carey. It's an honour to be closing out the year with you.
Oh, wow. After that intro, Rae, which listeners may think I wrote myself, but I didn't. But thank you for taking all my case notes. It's an absolute pleasure to be here with you and to, connect with the listeners. It's absolutely fantastic, and I'm very, very grateful for the opportunity.
Well, not the first time here, Steve.
No, it's not.
Back in the day in breakfast radio with Dukes, we used to have scary media moments, and that was probably a good 5 or 6 years ago that you used to come, not into the studio every Friday, but we have also known each other since 2013, and it was May, and it was less than 24 hours after my fateful knee hang catch trapeze sequence, which is more like a...
That sounds like a story we should discuss, actually.
It was a mid-air collision. It was a calamity. In radio speak, and you can still see my finger here is still not attached correctly.
And I think at the time I said to you, you really need to get that seen to because you hadn't. I said, are you crazy? You've got to get medical attention, but that's the kind of person you are. You push through.
Well, yes, and also adrenaline. That was the first time I realised how adrenaline does work in your system, and it was a mid-air collision on a trapeze, and my hand was probably the size of a football, and Steve that had noticed it because it was very hard to hide it.
How could you not? It would have only been good for hitchhiking.
Now, we're going to just dive straight in because we have so much to cover today in terms of imparting your amazing pearls of wisdom, experiences and insights around your illustrious career in not only journalism but media in general. But the obvious one, what got you into journalism?
That's a really interesting question, and the backstory is fairly interesting as well. I actually had loved English when I was at school, and that was one of the few subjects I actually excelled in. So when it came time to make a decision, and I left, and I had a choice after year 12, which so many of our audience, the parents and kids would have that choice too, was what do you do? Because still as a young person, you may have a notion of what you want, but do you really know? Do you really know? And so I did well. I got my the equivalent of my ATAR score, and I looked at it and I perused. And back in the day, can you believe that I was reasonably good at sport? Looking at me now, you'd think, hey, the shape you've chosen is a triangle, so what the hell are you talking about? But I swam for Queensland schoolboys, didn't do any good, but I was good enough at that level. I played football, and I thought, you know what? I think I could be a really good sports teacher. I think education is the way to go for me. But can you believe back then I didn't have enough of a TE score to actually make it into teaching? But I did have enough to make it into journalism. So now, of course, that's flipped a bit. But there was a guy called Big Cole, and I lost my father. Don't feel sorry, but I lost my father in a car accident when I was 9. So I was very, very blessed to have a strong network of people around me. My mum was from a very large family of 10, and I had enough uncles and their partners and whatever to help raise me up, which as a young boy was really important because I needed strong role models. Anyway, Big Cole, he never said much, but when he did, you listened. And I was lucky enough to listen. And he sent me a pen, and on it, he just had engraved Steve Carey. And the note he'd written was, "You can write forever." And what he was imparting by that, which luckily came to me, was he was basically saying you can do sports education, you can be a phys ed teacher, but at some stage your arms are going to pack it in, your legs, your knees, whatever. But if you take the other course that you may not consider, which is journalism, you can keep writing and you can write till the day you drop. So I actually went into and did a journalism course at the old QIT, which was Queensland Institute of Technology, which is now QUT. And the rest was history. You know, it just launched my appetite for good writing and meeting people and asking questions, because that was the other thing. I've always been inquisitive, and I've always had that inquisitive mind.
Goes hand in hand, doesn't it?
It has to. It has to. And the funny thing is that that's the other thing I'd say, if we're talking people making choices, life offers many choices. And you never know particularly which one, but find something you're passionate about. If you're passionate about it, you never really work a day in your life. And
Can I ask you a question about passion? In that I think passion comes when you are well, not perfecting, but when you've actually accomplished something. So I always think about, people like tax accountants who are very passionate about it. As kids, they're not passionate about tax accounting. They might be really good with numbers, but, I think their passion can build as we get to know something and understand it.
Or experience something, Rae. So here's a really quick backstory. My love of inquiry actually was sparked thanks to the army. Now, where I grew up, where my mother still lives in the house my father built, and she's still going. She's 97, but thank God we don't broadcast interstate, because if she finds out I won't get Steve, I'll get Stephen, which is always when I'm in trouble. But anyway, growing up after Dad died, my mates and I were sitting at the Army Oval where they used to fly the Chinooks down every now and again. And we were sitting there wide-eyed, and they flew this helicopter in, and the crew chief saw us and said, "Hey, boys, do you want to come for a ride?" Can you even imagine that now? Like, you wouldn't do it anyway. You couldn't do it because of insurance. But back then, and we all scrambled into the back of this helicopter, and it took off and just did a couple of laps. I'm not saying for a second that inspired my love of travel or anything, but it did open my eyes that there were different things that were happening just at a Nogra next to my house. Yeah. And that was the pivotal moment for me, where I thought, there's this big world out there. There's many other things I could be doing. I could be in the army. I could be an engineer. I could do this. I could do that. And it was a great moment. And we were all talking about it later on. And as a result, we also treated the army and all of the stuff that we used to go in, sneak in and, do things with, we treated it with much more respect.
and the power of a Chinook as well, as a young person.
It was incredible.
To understand, an aircraft like that and be connected to it. Do you still have the pen?
I do still have the pen. Absolutely, I do. Absolutely, I do. I don't use it very often because it was a fountain pen.
I was going to say, probably don't make the filler for it now.
But it was good. So that sparked my my real interest in doing different things, and even as a kid, But those were the two pivotal moments. And what Big Coal gave me was the opportunity to think clearly, and to take an opportunity to enter into a degree. Which took me much longer than it should have, because I also took the view that rather than, finish the 3-year degree, it took me 5 years. And people said, "What were you dumb?" They may be right. But what I was interested in getting a job first. And that's the other thing I'd say, which is really important, is it may not be the job you necessarily want right there at that moment. Yeah. But it's pretty hard to leapfrog to be head of news or an overseas correspondent or whatever you've got to start on the bottom of the ladder. And I always talk about careers as starting and getting a foot on the ladder. Yeah. You have to get a foot on the ladder. And the sooner you get a foot on that ladder and start ascending, the better it is. So you may not be in the job you really want, but if it's in the periphery, you might be just doing other things and you can work at it.
Yeah. I think that's really good advice straight off, and it leads me sort of into imagining you now in these early days that you're studying and you're working, and then probably becoming a cadet. And in those
the cadet story's a good one too, Rae.
Well, I almost cried when I read that, because you gave me some notes about what your thoughts were, not necessarily to punctuate everything in this show, but I loved that story about you being a cadet and what you learned. Your biggest learning moment. So I'm going to get you to tell that story. Yeah, it's beautiful.
There are two parts to it. The way I became a cadet very quickly was luck plays a part, right? And hard work plays a bigger part. But I was very lucky that I got my foot in the door at Channel 9. I was actually working on a country paper called the Redland Times, and it was a bi-weekly, and I loved that because I got to go to Lamb and Russell and Macleay Island and meet the local Country Women's Association. Of course, I was a young guy then, and I could eat as many cream donuts and everything else that was offered as I wanted. But it also taught me detail, and I had to do the shipping, so you had to get that perfectly right because that was very important. So that taught me accuracy. The luck part came in when a guy I went to school with, his brother was the senior producer at Channel 9 in Brisbane, and he gave me the intro to the news director, Ren Winders, who was a very forgiving man, because the way I got the cadetship was I went in and Ren had a list of things, and it was a 20-question Q&A of current and available news. And we talked first, and he gave me this thing, and I got 11 out of 20. And I thought, that's it. My career is over before it even starts. But Ren was really kind, and he said, you know what? Your general knowledge needs a lot of work, or a bit more work. But he said, you seem pretty garrulous. You can talk. And he said, that's really important. You've got to be able to connect with people. So I'll put you on as a third-year cadet. And that's how I got my start. And then the other part of the story is what taught me about journalism is that I was a police reporter for quite a while. And I was sent out to do a story on a guy who was a crop dusting pilot. And unfortunately, this bloke had inverted and he'd crashed the plane. And I just did it as a straight story, as a, man, 80-something dies in blah. I got back, and to my absolute chagrin, I was taught a very valuable lesson to ask beyond the obvious, because it turned out this guy was actually a World War II fighter pilot. He had an illustrious career. He'd come to the country because he wanted peace. He had a family that loved him, and I hadn't asked the most basic questions about his life. I just trained it off as, oh, well. Mm. And I learned then that, and I went back, my news editor again said, well, you're going to go back and do the proper story. So I went back. Oh, okay. I went back, and they were so generous. And that's what amazed me, and that's what humbled me, and that's what's helped shape my career, is that during the worst times of someone's life, as a reporter, you just front up without knowing them or no connection. People are genuinely courteous. They are genuinely lovely to you. I covered the Hoddle Street massacres with Julian Knight, and the hardest part of that was the next day and the next 48 hours going back and having to door knock the families of those who'd been hurt, killed, and traumatized. And without exception, every one of those people, bar one, invited me in, gave me a coffee or a tea, showed me photos, because they wanted to tell the story of their loved one. That was back then. I don't know if things have changed now, but I just took that as the greatest gift. I just thought, I'm in a position where I need to be courteous, I need to be respectful, and I need to let these people tell their story if they want to tell it.
But the thing that hasn't changed, Steve, is that it's human beings and the feeling of being cared for. It's just, you just can't compete with that. So even you're returning to the crop dusters family to revisit that.
And we had the time to do that then, Rae. That wouldn't happen today because the news cycle is so fast. You would return if you were working on another program. I guess I just want to labour on just a little bit, if I may, just on that feeling of being cared for, that those people probably gave you the benefit of more time because you cared enough to return and find out more about their person. Not, I want a better story, but I'm sorry, I feel ashamed that I didn't actually collect, the entire integrity of this man. And time is time. Space is something different. Yeah, well, I'm a great believer that time is the greatest gift because it's the one thing which once given, you can't get back. So you've got to use your time really, really carefully, and you've got to be careful who you share it on and offer it to, I think. But here's the other thing I also learned, there was a beautiful intro earlier, but what I would say too is that I don't think people like being talked at or told what to think, and that also shaped my journalism. And when I was a reporter, when I was a producer, when I was director of news, I tried to be very careful to make sure that people weren't talked down to or told what they had to think, and I think we see that currently. Was that
people that you were interviewing, or people
that was everybody? That was our ethic. Was you give the story, but give the facts of the story. Let people make up their mind. And I said when we were prepping for this show, and I believe it with all of my heart, is that no single news organisation anymore can be all things to all people. It simply cannot. There's too much vast information. There are too many interest groups at play. So what I say is, in the organisations that I worked for and I ran, we always tried to give both sides of the story, let people decide what they wanted. What I would urge your listeners to do is that don't just go down the path of the obvious. Actually test yourself sometimes to be open to a different podcast or a different point of view, because you may have your set view, but I try to do that in terms of, if I read something that I feel very strongly, yes, I'm in favour of that, then I often search for something that gives me a counterpoint, because it may not change my view, but it widens my horizon.
It doesn't. It opens up those neural pathways to something more, and that joins onto another experience. In fact, last night when I was going to pick up youngest son, Rory, from work. It was 11 o'clock at night and I really needed to listen to a podcast because I love learning from, now not learning just from experts, we're learning from just ordinary people. And I just happened to put on an interview with Matthew McConaughey and through the Diary of a CEO, Stephen Bartlett. And I thought, I know all about him. Why do I really want to listen to this? It was the only thing I could listen to. But what I got out of that was Matthew McConaughey through his dad. So he spoke a lot through his dad's voice. Don't half-ass it. And he went into so much detail about, you know, just not half-assing life, not half-assing a moment, and really trusting yourself when you jump. Know that that safety net will appear. And I thought, I'm so glad I listened to that before I came onto the show today. I thought, I'm not going to bloody half-ass it with Steve Carey.
It's that whole leap of faith thing, isn't it?
Yes.
That the universe will provide or something will come. And I think my life experience, that has fallen within the realms of truth, is something comes. You may not know it. It may be out there. I don't think it changes the fact that if you really want something, you also have to work for it. Like you can't, to that point, you can't half-ass it, to use your vernacular, but you can't just sit there and think, oh, well, it's going to come. You actually have to work at it. There is luck involved, but it's that old saying, and old Big Call, my uncle used to say it, the harder you work, the luckier you get.
Well, it builds trust in others too, doesn't it? In fact, somebody else was giving me an example of being in a workplace and somebody turned up to their job, to their profession, and said, oh, I'm so hungover today, I'm not going to be any good. And this person turned around to that person and said, how do you think everyone feels today about working with you? Because it's all very well to be hungover, but just don't say it, because that just builds a lack of trust. And also, well, how does that reflect on you? So don't half-ass it. If you're going to be hungover, give it 100%.
I won't be going to lunch after this.
But, you know, as we raced through this show, I knew how fast it would go. How do you think, just before we go to the next segment, the media scene has changed? Because I read your notes with such interest, and I went in with an assumption that social media, citizen journalism, it's all taken over. The whole the media scene now, or traditional journalism, is in the bin. But then you made me think about something different. So I just wanted to pop that bit in there and ask the question again: how has the media scene in Australia, back when you started, what is it now compared to that?
The simplest thing and the most potent is the speed of news. And by that I mean news still happens. News is still news. Unfortunately, there are bushfires, there are natural calamities, there are war zones, there are all the things that still make up the part and parcel of news. But what's changed is the pace of news and the ability to cover that news quickly and in a non-stop way. So by that I mean, when I started out in journalism, we didn't have mobile phones. We didn't have computers and all that sort of stuff. And the chief of staff would give me every day $1 in coins. I know this will sound incredible, because we had old tech pages and I'd get a beep, 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 which meant call the office. That was it. That's how basic it was. I'd use my 10 cents for the payphone. I'd call the chief of staff and he'd say, okay, there's an accident at blah, go there. How slow is that? You'd only have to do one story. When I was the police reporter, I'd start early in the morning. I'd go with the crew down the mountain, because I was at Brisbane in Mount Cootha. We'd go and do the police press conference in the morning, do the scene, talk to the relatives or whoever or whatever it was, come back up the mountain, I'd be done at like 11 o'clock or whatever. When I left, or when I left running news, one of the stories that most tweaks my mind and memory is the finding of Tony Mockbell in Glenfarda in Greece. And I had a reporter then, Norm Beeman, who was excellent. His ears would be burning, but he was a fantastic reporter. And he got the drop on the fact that Mockbell was hiding out in Greece. So I sent the crew, can you believe, I sent the crew to Greece. That was the most stressful week of my life, because we were running up a lot of money. Nobody else in network even knew. And the day that, or the night, midnight our time, that they found Mockbell and the raid was done, and Norm called me and said, we've got him, we've got it all. And I went, thank heavens. But the point of the story is then Norm had to do breakfast promos. He had to do the morning show at 11 a.m. He had to do radio. He had to do promos. He had to do news. He had to do Today Tonight. That was endless. And the pace was like that. It was so fast. So what's changed is when I was in, say, Rwanda or covering the civil wars and whatever there, I had to pay £25,000 for a 10-minute uplink via a satellite with 3 or 4 people running it, which is what I could now do on my mobile phone standing in the middle of the field, so long as there was a G network, of which China and Africa particularly have. So the pace rate is extraordinary.
£25,000.
Oh, yeah, that was back then.
That's a lot of
was
money.
back then, and I was covering part of that conflict because then Malcolm Fraser, who was the head of Care International, was going to one of the biggest refugee camps in the world in Tanzania, and that money was spent to get that moment of time, whereas I could have now done all of that with my mobile. So the pace is ridiculously fast, which means the pressure on journalists is extreme because there's a pressure to be first. And sometimes the pressure to be first confuses and can jeopardize
Integrity.
the truth.
Yep.
Because you're racing so fast, you're putting other people under pressure to, I need that information. I need what's happened.
Is there a prioritization of sensationalism over, say, the facts?
I've had that question so many times running a commercial news outfit, and what I would say to that is that, and some of your audience will gasp, but news is information wrapped up as entertainment. That, in my view, that does not mean it is page 3 people or stupid, crazy stuff. It just means that the news has to be presented in a way that is not only informative, but compelling enough to make you feel something. Because good news, or when I say good news, that can cover good, bad, whatever. News, in its essence, makes you feel something. It either makes you feel something with your head, and then it makes you feel something with your heart. So it's either the grand final, where we take the mark, and it's the amazing, or it's the tragedy of many, many communities and people hurting because of Black Saturday. But it still makes you feel something, but that does not mean you should jeopardize your integrity and your truth just to get a headline, and that is where the rubber hits the road, and it can be
I just
difficult.
had this mental picture of, somebody kicking the final goal in a grand final that is like, oh, and a goal was kicked, or this whole sensational, I can see how one would be more compelling over the other.
But it's storytelling.
Yes.
And here's the thing, very, very quickly, it's storytelling, and the best of the old 60 minutes. We used to call in the trade, you couldn't not watch 60 Minutes the night before, because if you didn't watch it, you couldn't be part of the next day, what we call the water cooler talk, which is where people would gather around the water cooler and they'd say, wow, what about that story? Did you see this? Did you see that?
Yeah.
Those stories. So, and most people would know this intrinsically, that if you hear a story that is so interesting that you stop and you listen, that's also probably something that's got some newsworthiness. But the trouble is these days, which we can get into, is the rise of the social media.
Well, that's,
and the social influencer.
Yes, and let's talk about that. I think that could be in segment 3. But Steve, it's now time for our very special moment that I've coined, the very special guest song request. I don't know if you've ever been part of this, but it's a time where I have a bit of fun queuing a song from your selection that you've given me, and you have to guess from my cryptically cryptic. There's layers of crypticism
really
here.
Now.
There's a clue. So there's a clue and you have to listen really carefully. So think about the songs you've selected, and here is the clue. Save me.
Oh, Save me must be Save Me, which means it must be Nina Simone.
Correct. And that's in Japanese.
Your Japanese was excellent. My hearing's, and I've only had one listen. But I do have a wife who speaks Japanese, so that's very lucky for me.
Did I say that all right, Inika?
Perfectly.
Great. Inika is actually in the studios today as well. Welcome, Inika. But I had to practice it, and I had to use the, how do you say save me in Japanese? I Googled that.
That is brilliant.
So there you go. Don't go away. We're going to be back after this song, and we're going to jump in to where you went from local news to becoming a foreign correspondent. So are you happy to take it from there?
Absolutely.
All right, don't go away. You're listening to 94.1 FM. It's 3WBC, and we'll be right back. Wow, what a tune. Welcome back. The time is just 31 minutes past 10 and you're listening to 94.1 FM. It's 3WBC with Rae Bonney and Steve Carey. Among many journalistic accomplishments, he was the news director at Channel 7 for more than 15 years.
No,
Less.
Sorry, we've got to do that at 10 years. I did Today Tonight for 6 as well.
Wow, okay. It's just... No, I'm
have to set the record straight if we're talking truth and news.
Well, the internet, you are wrong. So, Steve, an obvious question coming out of this Channel 7 10-year landscape. What was it like working with Tim Watson?
Oh, I love Tim Watson, Tim, and I know that you have a very soft spot for Tim.
No, I love
genuinely fantastic person. And here's a story that I don't think anyone knows. When I took over news, because I was a boy from Brisbane, even though I'd lived in Victoria for quite a while at that stage, and much to my dismay and, I should have known better. When I took over news, I didn't really realise, because I had grown up interstate, I didn't realise the legend of Tim Watson. I didn't realise his rich AFL history. I didn't realise, his premiership capabilities, everything else. And I remember when I took over news, Tim, I had to talk to everybody, and I got Tim inside, and I remember being a complete tool. And I basically said, now, mate, I don't really care about what you've done on the field, blah, 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 but I'm in news now, and you're doing sport, and we'll do it this way. And I look back at that, and I just think, what a fool.
And he was probably
that was not a leadership moment. That was I haven't done my homework well enough moment, and I haven't paid enough respect to him.
Was he a complete gentleman?
He was. Of course he was. Of course he was. It was Tim.
Yeah.
It was Tim. He's a fantastic bloke, a genuinely great guy to have around, and knowledgeable, and worked hard. And like a lot of the people I work with who came into the newsroom to do various presenter roles, what they all had in common, which successful people do, is that they had a work ethic was second to none. They were, by and large, all of them were humble. They wanted to learn. And when you gave them some advice, not only were they grateful for it, they put it into play, and they rehearsed, and they worked, and they worked, and they worked, which is what they would have done in their successful sport career. So, Tim, I'm sorry.
Oh, wow. Well, you were very generous in putting me in contact with Tim, and I did interview him on this show here back in, I think, 2016. And, for those of you who haven't listened to that show will know that I would probably not be here today if it weren't for Tim Watson. My childhood was very punctuated by care from Tim Watson, a kid himself, who had no idea about mental health problems or anything like that. It's a long story. Maybe you'll interview me on the show one day. But see,
this is the funny thing. This is the essence of news and news telling, though, Rae, is that every single person on the planet, whether they think they do or think they don't, but I'll say they do have a story. We all have intrinsically a story and something in us that is worth hearing, and that either makes us reflect or makes us better for hearing it. And it's the ones who share it in a compassionate sense, to me, that are very genuine in it, and you get that feeling of connectivity, which sometimes you don't on social, which we'll get to later on in the show. But yeah, Tim, great bloke, and you don't need 1,000 friends or 100. You just need a couple of people who've really got your. And I had that. I was lucky. Like I've mentioned, I've referenced Big Col. My mother never repartnered after my dad died at night. Everything was channeled into myself and my two sisters. And I was lucky that I had uncles and others there who were supportive of me, because I would have absolutely gone off the rails.
Yeah.
Absolutely. And that's why I think at the moment mental health is such a big story. Men's and boys' mental health is such a big story. We've got in Victoria, there's not a day goes by where there's not some story referencing, particularly boys and gangs out of control. I had personal experience of that, which I'm not going to necessarily go into, but this notion that all boys are bad or intrinsic is to me is anathema. It's a nonsense, and we, as news organisations, need to shine a spotlight on it, but more needs to be done to support those initiatives that can actually make a big difference.
Well, and you reference boys and gangs and things like that, and you know, a lot of my work that is with men and boys' health, not just here in Australia but around the world, is very focused on the lack of policy that we have in terms of how we're raising families, especially how we're raising boys. And we are still not even close. In fact, I think we're currently doing more damage by shaming boys on their way up, and we're not addressing issues that are quite prominent for boys. You know, and I'll say it out loud, sexual assault towards boys, nothing. There is absolutely nothing in the world that helps support boys that have that experience, nor the men that grow into very, very broken people. So get upstream and we might be making a difference. So anyway, this is about you, not about my work.
It's about people that are interested in listening to different views. So
yeah,
that's
and it is
good.
news. But jumping from local news to becoming a foreign correspondent is a big move. And, you know, talking about, you know, and we're going to move into some of those more moral traumas and things that are associated with these kinds of spaces and how that affected you. But what pushed you to take that step and drop yourself in such a spot?
It's another interesting, and again, everyone's different. Some people are happy to, and in journalism, there are many people who are happy to sort of go from start to finish with one organisation, which is becoming more difficult with fragmentation of media, by the way. But there are people who say, I'm only going to be a reporter, or I want to just be a producer, or X. I was lucky that the way I grew up and my mindset is I wanted to be many things. And the reason I survived so long in TV at 9, ABC and 7, and I still have a role, and I'm blessed because I have an inquiring mind. I have the ability to do it. I've been fortunate to make good connections. But that intrinsic change from doing local to international, I set my mind to it. I had a pathway and I gave myself a certain time frame to achieve certain things and certain milestones. We talked about earlier the ladder. My top of the ladder was eventually to be news director. That was, I'd always
From what
wanted.
age did you see that?
Well, clearly after I decided I wasn't going to be a sports teacher. But once I got into the game and I realised that the real power, yes, there's power as a reporter because you are an individual. There is power as a producer because you get to shape a bulletin. But the real power for me, I decided, was going to be director of news because that shapes the entire media landscape for that network and for your audience. So to get there, I decided, or I took a view that you had to have, like a mechanic, you had to learn everything about the car. You had to learn everything about how it worked, where the wheels went, how you drove it, how you fueled it, all the rest. So part of that playbook for me was I knew that I needed to be and wanted to be a foreign correspondent, and I set my mind assiduously to that task. And it wasn't that I was lucky. It was, in this case, I worked. And at the end, it didn't come easily, and it didn't come the first time.
What did you have to work at?
Well, work at the craft, work at becoming a better reporter, work at making sure that when the big stories happened, I put my hand up.
What about relationships?
Well, that relationships, when you say relationships, you mean personal or you mean professional?
Professional. Like, did you have to actually suck up to people, basically?
I don't think suck up is an
very
interesting
80s word.
It's a very interesting way of putting it. Look, you have to play part of the game in terms of you can't make enemies with the person who's running the foreign desk. You can't obviously make enemies of all of your peers who you want to support you. It's basically a candidacy, I guess. In some ways, you've got to be lucky. You've got to work hard. It has to, and because the states also are vying for their own people to go. I was lucky that I was in Melbourne at that stage because Melbourne, Sydney, the two biggest news areas. But it didn't come easy, and it got to the point where I put my hand up the first time, and I didn't quite think I would get it the first time. I put my hand up, and remember, these are rotating assignments. So every 2 to 3 years, they rotate through. I put my hand up 2 years later. I didn't get it. The third time, I actually went and I had to lay my cards on the table. And I said, look, to the powers that be, I said, look, if it's not this time, it's not going to be it. And I probably won't be at Network anymore. And at that point, I had enough good currency in the bank. I'd done enough hard work. I'd covered Olympic bids. I covered not war zones necessarily, although I've been by that stage to Papua New Guinea and East Timor and other places. So I'd got a good level of experience under my belt. I was no longer the Green Cadet. And fortunately, my poker game I didn't want to leave Network. It was the last thing I wanted, but I just thought if I don't do it, I'm not going to be true. And then I landed the job as the Europe correspondent for the 7 Network, based in London, and covered more royal stories than I care to remember.
Yes. Now, that itself has a story behind it, doesn't it?
Yes, it does. So, in a nutshell, I got to London, very wide. I'm very grateful. And I was lucky to have as my boss then a very older, experienced guy called John Wiseman, who was great. But our brief back then was basically if a royal corgi, tweaked a foot, you covered it. And I got to the point, I got very full of myself, and I called Foreign Desk one day and I said, that's it. I don't want to do any more royal stories for at least a month. I said, we're not doing any more royal stories. It's enough. And I proudly banged down the phone, and I looked at BBC, and news was breaking then of the scandal involving Sarah Ferguson and a guy called Johnny Bryant.
The toe-sucking
incident.
Yes.
And I looked at the crew, and they looked at me, and I said, right, well, that didn't last long.
Because it's not about what you want, it's about what they want, right?
And you know what? They were right, because you've got to also, while telling stories, you have to tell stories that people are interested in. Otherwise, if no one's watching and no one's listening and no one's reading, what's the point? You can't shape or change anything. So the powers that be back here in Australia were far more attuned than the bloke in the field. And at that stage, it's clearly waned now, but at that stage, the appetite for royal stories, particularly royal scandal, was absolutely enormous.
How much spin had to go on to those kinds of stories? Like, did they have gatekeepers there?
Oh, yes, of course.
Would only allow you
every
to tell
organisation. It's a great question, because we think of spin only in mega organisations. The truth is, part of a journalist's role and the realm of seeking truth and shining a light into places people don't want you to look in, there's spin in everything.
I only learned the term flacking because I had to look it up.
Well, what is flacking?
Media flack.
I see. A media flack. Yes, media flack, or a flunky is somebody that, is there at the behest of people that they work for to run blocks and throw journalists off the scent and all this sort of stuff. And another disingenuous name for it in a high profile way is it's basically, some would call that PR, public relations, but that denigrates all those hard-working, fantastic PR consultants and others, which we won't do. But look, a flack or a flunky like that, they're running block for people that, for example, we only have to go as far as the Harvey Weinstein stuff, or Jeffrey Epstein, or any of those myriad of things. So you've got to be reasonably tough. And herein lies the rub. If you're a political rounds person, or a sports journalist, or a crime person, invariably you make contacts with, and you become very close to, or you can become close to, people who are on the other side of the fence. And when push comes to shove and there's a story breaking and you've got to do that story, or you should do that story, then it can become problematic, because you're putting friendships on the line, you're putting relationships on the line. And you've got to be true to yourself. And that's where some journalists, most win, some fail. But bear in mind, we're not AI bots. Journalists aren't robots, they're people. And the reason they're people is that people connect best with those who are telling a story in a genuine way. So
how do you balance all of that, especially as a younger person? So you've got the benefit of hindsight and wisdom and experience, but back then, where you really want to keep your job, but also you want your trajectory to continue upwards. How do you balance the consumer need, the actual event, and your own integrity all at once?
It's funny, I never really had a problem with it, because I guess it was also because my upbringing was really strong. And I'm not saying that those that fall by the wayside aren't or haven't, but it can seduce you. I mean, I remember when I was director of news, you 1 minute you're rubbing shoulders with, multi-billionaires, and you're being treated to and faded to and having access to things that most people wouldn't do once in a lifetime, let alone literally many times. And then on the next moment, you're at a charity event trying to help people who need help. So depending on where you sit, I always said to Inika when we were, at these events, I said, enjoy it now, but don't get swept away by it.
Yes.
I was very grounded. Because of my upbringing, I was very grounded. I mean, I came from a family that lived next to the army barracks. So my upbringing was very solid. And I never got seduced into thinking that it was more than a passing phase.
Yeah.
So while I enjoyed it, I never took it for granted and I never overplayed it. And I remember, I won't say who, but I met a certain billionaire who comes from a very strong media family.
God, that wouldn't be hard to figure out.
And no, and that's fair enough. And I remember sitting there with this person and I said, look, you run a massive organisation. I said, here's the deal. If my journalists and we find you're doing the wrong thing, we will be doing that story. Absolutely no question. I said, but what we won't do is we won't leave it to the last minute as we're about to go to air to put those questions to you. And from his point, I never forget, he said, and for that, I respect you. And that was intrinsic to me, was that we tried to treat people with the same level of respect. But in media, the way it goes is it's a David and Goliath scenario for your listeners. So when I was running Today Tonight, if somebody came to me who was from a small family and they had a beef with a giant insurance company, we would always initially take the role of and support the family.
Yes.
Until we were proved wrong, because it's that David and Goliath. You want to support the person. But we're always open to as well if the facts lie where they lie. So if it turned out that the family had actually been doing the wrong thing,
yes,
and we found, well, we're not going to go and attack. So we under me, we tried, and I'm not saying others don't, but I was very careful about the responsibility that we had. I was careful to try to not to ram down people's throats an opinion or an agenda. And an example of that was, which I'm to this day still proud of, when the Bay dredging happened, which caused enormous friction in Melbourne. That's going back a long time
Still
now.
does.
Still does. But we hired a guy called, I kid you not, Marine Boy, which is fantastic. And I sent this guy, we commissioned him and we plotted through various parts of the bay where the dredging was. And he went and took underwater vision every year for several years. Now, what that allowed us to do was to be totally independent. We weren't at the behest of the Greens. We weren't at the behest of the Port of Melbourne Authority. We actually were able to tell a story without fear or favour of what was really happening. And for that, I think, and I'd like to think, we got marks and we got kudos for that.
Yeah, well, that's responsive journalism rather than
it's
reactive,
expensive journalism too, and that's the trouble. And that's, at the end of the day, commercial television is a business. So
had a big argument with Rory yesterday about advertising, about media advertising, and what that really means. Anyway, that could take up a whole show. But I wanted to also touch on moral injury. So if you think about things like vicarious trauma, PTSD, and I'm thinking more in context of your time as a foreign correspondent, we don't give enough airtime, I think, to journalists or media people who are on front lines. And it could be, even when you were reporting on police matters, knocking on people's doors, that, moral injury is a psychological, social and spiritual impact that can occur when a journalist witnesses, perpetrates or fails to prevent events that violate their moral beliefs. I Googled that and I just read that out. They weren't my words.
I'm glad you acknowledged that quote.
It's not recognised as a mental disorder, but I think we're learning a lot more about it now because of just what's going on in the world and some of the outcomes under the lens of being more aware of mental health problems. Did you?
I couldn't agree with you more. And I mean, when I started, there was... In fact, when I started, it was considered a weakness if you couldn't, quote, man up and go and do the hard stories. And the hard stories involved going to crash scenes, seeing, without being indelicate on a Sunday morning, seeing things that you don't necessarily want to see and that police and emergency services would see. But you're basically a reporter. You're not an emergency services person. You're just, in my case, still pretty green and young and doing terrible car accident scenes, bearing in mind my father died in a car accident. And I was, when I was older and went to, say, Rwanda, which was, I think, 1993-ish, and, in Tanzania was then the biggest refugee camp in the world. It was 250,000 people. And some of the people coming out of that war zone, I don't even know how they were walking. I don't even know how they were still standing. And
or any will to live.
Or anything. But and so what happens is, for our listeners, is that 1 minute you're sitting at home in your nice home in Australia, then you jump in a plane, you go to Perth, from Perth you go to South Africa to Kenya. We snuck across into using, I don't know who they were, but they were American pilots, so make your own view. We got in a Red Cross plane. We flew across Lake Victoria, and next minute, after a 4-hour bumpy ride through the jungle and bush, we're in the world's biggest refugee camp in 2 pup tents, which for your audience are little tiny 2 or 3 man tents. Carried our own water, our own supplies. There's no drinking water. People are dropping like flies. Kids are sucking on corn husks because there's no food. How does your mind cope with that by itself? But then you've got to be in work mode where you're covering that and trying to give the lens of, this is what's happening here, to an audience back in Australia that are so divorced from it at that stage because we don't have and didn't have the internet or anything else or social media. Most people are unaware of it. And then you finish the story 2 weeks later, you come the reverse, and Network says, for your efforts, thanks very much. We're going to put you up in a luxury hotel in, of all places, Johannesburg, which was a bit of a powder keg then, and you can have some R&R. So R&R back then was, quite a bit of drinking.
Yes.
which is, the old thing, you self-medicate, but it's not necessarily the best medicine at all.
What we know about the impact on mental health and trauma is it just exacerbates.
So when I became news director and when I was running TT, but particularly when I took over news, I made sure one of the things I did do was I made sure that people who needed help were given and had the availability to get help had they needed it. And Network now, I'm absolutely certain.
What kind of help would you connect them with?
Personal crisis help, personal,
I was just thinking what was around then.
Well, there were still psychologists and people to talk to, and it was all paid for by Network, but bottom locker. I never was given a report. It was literally, I'm struggling. And one of the best reporters, again, that I ever had, a guy, Peter Morris, Zoomer, we used to call him because he was dashing here, there and everywhere. He was doing police for a while, and he came to me one day, and it was a story, something had triggered. He was up in the bush, and I'd sent him, and it involved a child. And he came back in and had been doing it for years. I'm sure he won't mind me saying it. He was a terrific bloke, still is, but he said, I'm done. He said, I just can't do this anymore. And rather than push him, I just said, I'm really so sorry to hear that, and I'm really sorry that you're thinking of leaving, but whatever you need, we'll do. And he's just one of a few, I think, that had to walk away. He's still in the industry, and a great bloke, but for me, I guess trauma has informed part of my life and has been not necessarily a friend, but it's been a constant, because the other thing that happens is you give so much of your time to network and work, relationships suffer and marriages crumble and friendships change. So it's something to be aware of. But Network now, I know the war correspondents particularly, there are courses that they send them through, and there are things that they do, and there are fixes in every field. I mean, it's extraordinary.
I love evolution, how we mess up about 80%, but we fix about 20 at all times, and can't fix the human condition though. But a bit of laughter helps us segue, Steve, to a perfect moment to introduce our next very special guest song request, which I'm very excited about, no doubt, or are you terrified?
I'm terrified. I've been more nervous at these song requests because I know
tests.
I know.
Tests. Love testing. It's the only time I'm in control of the show. So here goes. Here's your clue. A spoonful of sugar. Julie Andrews.
A spoonful of sugar.
Think about it.
Better than?
No.
No. Oh, no.
Okay, think about what
makes the medicine.
What's made out of sugar?
Sugar. What's made out of sugar?
Like Candy, maybe.
Oh, candy flu. Okay.
So,
all right.
so
Thank heavens. Thank you for helping me.
So a spoonful of sugar helps the medicine go down.
Candy flu. Okay.
Yeah.
That's interesting. It's an interesting one because this is a guy, the Walking Who.
Yes.
And this is a really interesting backstory. He's an Australian artist who actually is creating amazing music from a World War II tunnel in Prague.
Yes.
Now, I didn't get any further than that, but it just, I love the music, but it also tweaked that you can do anything anywhere.
Yes, you can. Even in a World War II
tunnel.
Yeah.
I'm only 1 for 1 now. I didn't get candy flu.
Oh, well, you still got a few to go. Anyway, you're listening to 94.1 FM. It's 3WBC. And when we come back, I really have no idea what we're going to talk about, but it will be something, so don't go away. Welcome back. The time is, I don't know, actually. It's about 59 minutes past 10. You're listening to 94.1 FM. It's 3WBC with Rae Bonney. I'm joined by Steve Carey, one of Australia's most accomplished TV news and public affairs personalities. Did I get that one right?
You sort of, I guess, yes. I'm always hesitant because, you know, the rise of the celebrity, the rise of the cult of social media, I never feel comfortable with it. And through my career, I didn't try to make myself the centre of the story. I tried to make myself the teller of both sides. And I think that's probably a good place to remember. I still do, and I'm so grateful. I mean, I'm very, very grateful. I've had a long career. And I'm still doing it. I'm still doing, you know, Spin Doctors on ABC with Ali Moore, and I'm doing, you know, ABC TV once a fortnight with, well, I was there for the last show with the lovely Michael Rowland, who's just the nicest person, and Bridget. And I'm very grateful. I'm very, very grateful.
Not to mention 3WBC with Rae Bonney.
And not to mention 3WBC with Rae Bonney, of course, which is right up there. And it is actually because you're connecting with people who, you know, we talked earlier about time. At the moment, people are giving us their time, and I'm always grateful of people who give their time. And you should give something back if you can. And it can't just, what's the worst thing you can be on radio, Rae?
Silent.
Boring.
Oh.
Yes. So silent covers that base. So we always say, you know, I was doing media training. People say, oh, you know, I've got to do this or that. I said, no, you've just got to tell stories and you've got to be entertaining.
Yeah.
And you've got to get people engaged.
Well, I want to reference Matthew McConaughey again because he's he thought, in this interview, everyone, you must listen to it because he was very thoughtful about his answers, which created a lot of dead air. And it was like, have I just dropped out? Because we're so used to our internet dropping out. Your brain automatically goes, oh, do I still have a connection? Before you think, oh, he's thinking about that.
I would say a good radio is not filled with huge, long gaps of space because it's great for him to be thinking about it. But, I mean, if he's telling his life story, surely you don't need a lot of time to reflect on every single aspect of that. Or do a bit of
lip smacking or a bit of swallowing or something just to say you're still there. So I have a question for you.
Yes.
What does it feel like being you today?
Being me today? Being me today feels absolutely fantastic. And, you know, that was a question that I put to myself a lot, and I actually had some professional help. And I'm not afraid to say that, you know, you can teach an old dog new tricks. And what I've learned along the journey is I've had some personal pain and anguish. I've lost some people extraordinarily close to me and dear to me, and at one stage that really crippled me. Like that, I thought that was just the worst thing ever. And I went and I got professional help from a fantastic person, and he posed to me. He said, "What are you doing?" He said, "What are you actually doing at the moment?" I said, "Oh, you know, I'm floating here and there. I finished up from the company I helped found in June. I'm doing a Japanese course, and I've only done 1 and a bit lessons, but loving it. I'm learning drums, which is fantastic. I'm, designing tattoos. And
I didn't know that one.
Well, there you go. And when I say designing tattoos, if we had an ability to broadcast a photo, my design work is akin to that of a toddler, and that would be insulting the
right,
toddler.
Because I'm looking at Inika going, no drawings on her yet. I can just see you just with, a scalpel and some ink with your old fountain pen at home.
Exactly. So, and the other thing I do, I'd written or refined and written a children's book that eventually I'll self-publish because no one else in their right mind would be willing to. But what I'm saying is, and to your audience, what am I doing? And this question came to me, and I said, that's what I'm doing. And this guy said, what you're actually doing is you're living. And the moment he said that, it connected. And I thought, yeah, I'm actually living. And for the first time, I'm not worried about getting up, super early, although I'm an early riser. I'm not worried about where the next thing's coming from. I'm actually giving myself the best gift of all, which is I'm having time to think and breathe and just enjoy and do. And after a long, 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 long career, this is the first time since I was a little kid that I've actually, since my father died, I basically went and started. Even from 9, I was doing things to help bring money in for the family. And this is the first time I've genuinely, been within myself, but had time to reflect. And it is the most incredible gift, the most mind-expanding, wonderful thing. And I practice gratitude every day. I try and do something nice for someone, whether it's a smile. You can't understate a smile. Walking around the Glen or Box Hill here, people are busy in their everyday. They look up and you just give them a smile. They smile back and it's like, yeah, that felt good. So it's, it's a nice thing, particularly coming into this time of year and at a time of year we've had where there's been so much unrest and continues to be. And unfortunately with news, because that's what I'm kind of here to talk about, is that the news diet can feel very bleak and very dark. But we shouldn't take away the fact that there are many, many great things. So I'm living.
I am always reminding people are mostly good and the world is amazing. We live in the safest, most peaceful time ever in the existence of life, the most peaceful. And people go, how could that be? But what about the war? And you think about it. Think about our healthcare, our standards of living. And I know that's not that for everybody, but generally we are the most peaceful and the most safe and healthy than we've ever been.
And that's where news and journalists have a role to play, which is you cannot just stick to the script of hyperbole all the time.
Sorry, can you say that? What's that?
You can't stick to the script of hyperbole. That just means you're using language that is either inflammatory or using an extreme.
Hyperbole.
Or, you're going out of your way to make something sound worse
So
than
you
it
just
is.
made that word sound so easy. How do you say that in Japanese? I'm going to put that to you. There you go.
I have no idea. But the good thing is, and even during what was I running during 9/11, I was the second in charge at Today Tonight, and I'll never forget this story. I was lying in bed. It was about 11 o'clock, whatever, and again Norm Beeman, who I've referenced before, called and he said, "Scary," because that's my nickname. I'm Steve Carey.
And he was
Scary.
was he the
and
beam?
he said, "Turn on your TV." He said, they've attacked America. I said, "What are you talking about, Norm?" He said, they've killed thousands. I said, "Norm, stop drinking." So I turned on the TV. Of course, I turned on just in time to see the second tower come down. I then called the guy who was running Today Tonight at that stage, Neil Moondog, and I called him. And I kid you not, he said exactly the same. He said, "What are you talking about?" He said, "Have you been drinking?" I said, "No, turn on your TV." And at that point, the whole network came alive and we did endless 24-hour coverage. But what we were very careful of, and it didn't twig straight away, but that repetition of those terrible images didn't just affect us or the editors. It affected everybody. And at reasonably quickly, we took a decision that where we could limit showing buildings collapsing and people, we tried to pull back. It's a very hard thing to stop a media beast in full flight. Particularly when you've got a story of that magnitude that's coming in. But you've got to be respectful of and reflective of the fact that you are talking to a very broad church. You're talking to parents, older people, young people, children.
Yep.
So one of the stories that we did very, very quickly was, how do you tell your children what's happening in an uncertain world that they are okay? And that is critical, in my view, in any news outfit that's covering these major big events. The language you use, the images you use, the time slot you're in, and how you can balance the ledger to say, okay, this is what's happening. But to your point, we're here. and you'll be okay.
How has that changed now, given, as you said, the speed of media now? Back in 9/11, where things were slower, you had to literally turn on your TV to see what was happening. Whereas now, how do we protect our kids, or how do we educate our children how they consume news when we don't have much control over it?
And that's the absolute $1 million question. That is one of the biggest questions of the time in which we live at the moment, which everyone is grappling with. And as I said earlier, you can't be all things to all people. I can't have the answer to all that. All I can say is, as a parent, I know, and having been a parent of young, I know exactly how difficult it is it's very easy for experts to say, well, just turn off the internet or turn off the phone, or that sometimes causes more friction and chaos,
curiosity, doesn't it?
Than anything, So I'm not here to tell people how to live their lives or raise their kids or do anything. All I'm saying is, from a media sense, it compounds what can be a problem, particularly amongst teenage girls.
Well, we've just seen,
boys.
The recent legislation around the ban on social media.
Yes, and how do you enforce it?
Well, there's that. I mean, it's a limitation and it's a risk management thing, but also, is it hitting the mark? Are we just trying to put a Band-Aid on top of something, whereas the intervention more might be around educating parents on their own use of social media that influences their children?
One of the things I think would be potentially good to look at is the rise of the social influencer. And influencers now have quite often a greater role in a child's mental health, upbringing and attitudes than their parents, their peers, whatever. And if you take some of the toxic male role models that are out there on sprouting misogyny and hate and other things, they're the sort of questions that I like or would like to be addressed.
So, but what's the replacement for that? So, I see that come up a lot in the men's health space about these toxic people, and they're terrible. There is no doubt about that. However, you talk about big coal. If you imagine you've got a big coal in your space, and your father's role modeling really well, and he's turning up because he's not at work 24/7. So what are we doing in our space to provide our children with the ingredients that they need to be inspired? Because it's all very well to go, oh, Andrew Tate, that's really terrible. But how are you feeling that space?
Well, you've got to break down. You've got to present role models that are better.
But we're just screaming and yelling about what is bad, and forgetting that parents, unfortunately, I'm generalising now, often will have devices in their hand as they're telling their kid to get off theirs.
That's exactly right.
Because we're all part of it. So we have to role model these behaviours, but also turning up for your kids, being there. I've got adult kids now, but I'm there for them all the time. George lives in London. Every time he rings, I will pick up the phone like he's the only person in my world. So he knows that I'm there. I'm not writing him off, oh, he's an adult. No, he's a big boy. Look after yourself. He can do that, but I'm still his parent. I'm still role modelling for him.
There's no easy answer, but what I would say is that a cohesive, considered approach across different media platforms with policies that people can actually adhere to, where there's, speaking with one voice. You can't dismiss the power of speaking from and with one voice. When you get a whole stack of fractured voices scream, and you get people screaming from the wilderness, when people scream, you tend not to, or the challenge is you might only hear the person scream. You don't hear the ones that actually have something knowledgeable. I mean, there's no question it's a very difficult space, but it's intrinsic of all media too. I mean, media is fracturing. The demise of traditional media is overstated. I still say that there is a massive place, and one of the most potent media platforms around is still your 6 o'clock primetime news.
Will, please tell.
Well, the reason I say that is that not everybody has the time or the inclination to, much as I've urged earlier, graze on many news
Is that
outlets.
A demographic that is...
Of course it is. It's usually an older demographic, and we used to call them rusted-on viewers, very hard to get off. So to get them was hard, to keep them once you had them was a little easier because they tend to stick.
So then what happens now as that generation passes through? How are we inspiring our younger generations in traditional media?
Well, the way we're inspiring them is to try and do, well, you've got a lot of journalists now who are on social media themselves trying to connect in different ways. News editors are attuned to what their audience want. News editors and producers, journalists, chiefs of staff are very capable in terms of finding a social media viewpoint, and they'll chase it. And for example, newspapers at the moment, part of their daily algorithm is they'll put a story out knowing that it will get clicks and likes. They'll monitor that. They'll have a look almost minute by minute. They can tell who's on, who's not, what stories have the most impact. So unfortunately, from a news sense, sometimes following that path means that a really, really worthy story, a really worthy, great story about a massive breakthrough and a medical breakthrough won't get the same interplay as two influencers who had a fight down at St Kilda Boulevard. And the reason for that is that, as I've said earlier, commercial news outfits are, by definition, commercial. Yes. They are there to get eyeballs on TV. They're there to get readers. They're there to get listeners. So the challenge, therefore, is that you have to have people within an organisation who've had enough experience, age, I hesitate to say wisdom, but who've had the knowledge to go, okay, that's interesting, and we'll put that in, but we're not going to throw the baby out with the bathwater. We're not going to have just an entire show of just nonsense and, silly stories and everything else. And when I was running news, I always took the view that news was like a great meal. You have an entree, a main, dessert, and, cheese and coffee, whatever at the end, so that when you left, you felt like you'd actually had something. It was, and I can't take credit for this, but the guy I work with at Today Tonight, Neil Murney, used to say, you don't want something that's all bun and no meat.
Yes.
So by that, he was saying, you've got to give people something to take away with, otherwise there's no point.
You were talking about influencers and made me think about clickbait and the evolution of social media. Do you think consumers are becoming more demanding in now? Clickbait, we're onto that. We just ignore that because we know that that's trying to lead you into something that perhaps is sensationalist. So do you think we are becoming more savvy as consumers, that we're not buying so much into influencers, that we might want to get back to more traditional methods?
I don't think so, unfortunately, which pains me to say, but I actually don't think so. From where I sit, I don't see that there's evidence that there's a massive swing back to, quote, traditional. And I think the truth is, social media, it has I'm not so old school that I go, there's only traditional, and if you don't watch the mainline news, you're a fool. That's a nonsense.
What about other methods of education? Like Rory yesterday was watching the Netflix series on Chernobyl. And he gets a lot of his information from watching documentaries, and he takes it upon himself to find out what he needs to punctuate or to support what he's learning at school. So he'll learn something from a teacher, then he'll go and find out more about it through those methods. So do you think some of the documentaries that are being produced in our streaming services are accurate enough that that's kind of a form of...
I think from the documentaries I've seen, particularly the Netflix ones, they're extremely well researched, but quite often they have their own barrow to push. So, for example, it might be, the meat industry or avocado industry or what we're doing to the oceans.
Yes.
There's usually a barrow to push. I haven't seen a lot of documentaries apart from the David Attenborough ones that genuinely you can say don't have a barrow. But hopefully the way they're presented, when you graze on those or take them in, you actually go and do what Rory does, and you go and you look at other things. As I said right at the start of the show, nothing can be all things to all people anymore. No. And, the great thing, as I was about to say before, so traditional media has its place. I don't decry the rise of social media. I worry about the fact that we take influencers who have no journalistic background and are sometimes pushing their own barrow as the gospel source of truth. That concerns me because journalists, by and large, are people who do the best they possibly can with a social conscience, and they try and tell the truth. And the most devastating line in modern history is when they coined the phrase "fake news" with President Trump, because that was a killer statement, and it played into the whole conspiracy theory and everything's, that old media has got an agenda. I'm sure of course there are people who've got an agenda.
Yes.
Of course, but the use of, you're ultra right wing or you're ultra left, to me is just a device to shut down conversation. So if you had a really serious viewpoint, Rae, I would like to think that I will sit politely and listen. I may not agree with it, but if the power of your argument is powerful enough to persuade me otherwise, then I'd hope that I could be attuned to that. Social media quite often knocks out that ability to listen. And I will be a little controversial and say, back in the day, there was only one village idiot in a village screaming into the wind with a limited amount of people. Social media has allowed an entire planet of, village commentators to scream into the wind and find like minds that then do the old squeaky wheel thing. So it has never been more important to have journalists working as journalists, well-funded, independent, who can actually give us a story. That's why, for example, in the extremely complicated and very highly inflamed Middle East situation at the moment, or Ukraine, that I don't read and watch a lot of other extraneous opinion conspiracy stuff. I try and get my sources from credible outlets and people that I have followed for years and that I know.
Can you?
Well, John Lyon is one. ABC's John Lyon is one. BBC, I follow. I even look at some of the Al Jazeera stuff because, to the point earlier, that I want a converse view. But I rarely jump super quick these days to make something in a value judgment sense. For example, the recent arson attack on the synagogue in Corfu. A shocking thing. And that has actually done more to inflame the whole focus of anti-Semitism than just about anything in recently. And it's focused the minds of politicians, it's focused the minds of police, the community, and everyone else to that.
Yeah.
So that's a situation where something has happened as a pivotal moment.
Yes.
But it's not easy. It's not easy. And the easiest thing is to feel so emboldened and impassioned that you speak without thinking, or you post, and that's the dangerous thing too now. You post something, it's there. It's like I could say something to you off camera or off mic, and it's okay, but now everybody's trawling through every single piece of minutiae, and both sides are rabidly looking, and you saw that in American politics. That was bitter. The famous Kamala, you're fired from Trump. I mean, jeez. It's just been an extraordinary.
How do you, when you're consuming news, is there a division between critiquing news and consuming news for you?
That is such a great question. And it's, you know what? I haven't really thought about that, but now that you've put me on the spot, I think because of my background, if it's a big story, I will sit there and in my mind,
I want to be there.
Exactly right. In my mind, I'll go, I wish I said this is the way I would have structured the bulletin, or I'll be sitting there with Inika who gets sick of me going, and I'll get really inflamed. Oh, why did they do that? Oh, come on. Or why didn't they give me that opinion? Or what was the news director thinking? So there's that part, and then I'll pull back, and then after I get it, I'll take the time then to have a look at my socials and my other things that I follow. And, I still have the luxury now that I'm basically semi-retired. I can sit and read the paper, and I love, and my daily routine is to decompress. I am religious with my Herald Sun crosswords. I do the quick crossword to make myself feel smart. Then I do the cryptic combo to bring me back to earth.
Because you love a bit of cryptic, don't you?
I'm a cruciverbalist, which is just another way of saying I like doing crosswords.
Well, I think I should be writing down all these new words that I'm learning today. Thank goodness now the show is now produced on Spotify, iHeartRadio, Apple Podcasts, and still on their traditional YouTube channel. So if anyone's wanting to listen into this show again, so you can reflect on all of those new words like that one that you
cruciverbalist, which is just another way of saying I'm into crosswords. And if my mother-in-law was listening, we have a joke that's what we are, cruciverbalists.
Well, there you go. I love that. I love it. I love a new word.
Bit of hyperbole.
Yes, and that one too. Anyway, we are coming up now. We've missed all the questions for that segment, but I think what we produced there was pretty amazing. And my phone is blowing up, so I'm assuming somebody's listening in and has something to say. Well, so we'll.
They might be there to correct me on what I'm saying. I'd say.
Well, you know what the time is, don't you?
Well, I do know. It's 22 past 11.
We're up to the perfect little segue into the next special guest
I'm
song
so
request.
onto it now. I'm listening actively. I'm ready.
So we're whittling them down, Steve. Can't be that hard. Now this one could have been at midnight last night after I'd gotten home from picking Rory up. Damn Court Jump.
Damn Court Jump.
Yeah.
Lake Street Drive.
That's it.
Oh,
get it?
Thank heavens. Lake Street Drive. Yes. No. You will explain it.
Yeah, I just
better than
because I thought better than what, you know, but it was a pretty low blow. Really.
No, I like this one.
So what's this one about?
Oh, it's just, I just like that it's a relaxed groove. Here's the thing, you get set in your ways, right? So I grew up in the 60s and 70s, so it would be very easy for me to say that's the greatest generation of music and just stick with all that. So. But thanks to my daughter introducing me to bands like Amyl and the Sniffers, which would be totally inappropriate for this program. But I try every day or every week to listen to new music and just let the algorithm take me where it wants to go. And in doing that, you find some fantastic new music and things that can just chill you out. And I was thinking on a Sunday, I think this is a nice one for the audience.
Well, I just sort of collected something spontaneous then because I heard your beautiful daughter mentioned.
Yeah.
And
Kate.
I heard of trying new things. Did I see you with dogs in a Santa suit? Did I?
Yes, you did.
I did. Okay.
And all of my friends find that hilarious because my daughter, it's amazing the things you do for your children, right? And what you will subject yourself to. And Kate works at a wonderful place, if I'm allowed to say it, called Dogtown.
You sure can.
Grooming at Moorabbin. And she's been working there. And you know what? Here's the other thing I learnt. I've never seen the kid so happy. I've never seen her so chilled and loving it and getting up early and going
kid, I'm
off.
sure she's a woman by now.
Well, yes, thank you you're quite right, my beautiful daughter. And it's really wonderful to see. And she said a few weeks ago, quite like a couple of, she said, "Oh, Dad, would you come and be Santa at Dogtown?" I said, "What?" I said, "Yeah, I guess." So I went out.
You did not. You went, "Get me there. Where's the suit?"
I actually went out and bought a $12 Santa suit. The owner of the business had a look at it and said, "Our dogs and clients deserve much better than that." She went and bought like a really full-on Santa suit. So I frocked up on Friday. It was as hot as hell. I thought I was going to die. I had the best fun. I had dogs all over me. No one got bitten, thank heavens.
Yeah.
But some of the dogs, I can tell you, are no fan of Santa. The look on their eyes as they were sitting back. But I had a great time. And it made great memories with my daughter. You know, it's fantastic.
Is that another version of living?
It is. It is another version of living. Exactly. So now I'll just have to write an Easter Bunny outfit coming up.
Yeah, gosh, yeah. Anyone wanting anything in life, just phone up Steve. He'll give it a crack. Don't half-ass it. Yeah. You're listening to 94.1 FM, 3WBC. Don't go away. We'll be right back. Oh, welcome back. The time is just 11:29 and you're listening to 94.1 FM. It's 3WBC with Rae Bonney and Steve Carey. On the spot, Steve. How do you encapsulate everything that is you these days?
Oh,
basically, who are you?
That's the question. Who am I? One day Santa, one day Japanese student, one day drummer. And that's the other thing.
Yeah.
A shout out to my wonderful drum tutor, Jeremy Lee, because, you know, life's a journey in music. You shouldn't live a life of regret, right? But one of the things I do kind of just a little bit regret is that I didn't have the ability to play music more in my early life. And I was so hopeless at drumming when I was at primary school. I do remember I played the double bass and I was boom, 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 and I got it wrong. That was the last time I was on the double bass, and it's only in the last, this year that I've taken up the drumsticks, and I am loving it.
Are you good at it?
No, I'm terrible. I'm like, for those of you who are old enough who are listening, I'm like Ferris Bueller out of Ferris Bueller's Day Off, where he's in the shower and he's got the sax or whatever, and he's going. Never had a lesson. That's me. But I'm enthusiastic, and it's another thing to look forward to.
To anyone that's learning to play the drums, my question is: have you played "In the Air Tonight" by Phil Collins, the drum solo?
No, I have not. I have not. I've got a few that I kind of like, but it's just the joy of being able to sit there and smack out a rhythm and have somebody in my tutor, Jeremy Lee, who's so generous with his time, and this is something in life too, somebody who just supports you because they know it's important to you and who's passionate about it, but actually lifts you up and doesn't make you feel bad about it. It gives you a kick when you need it, but not in a bad way where you're sort of curling up in the corner sucking your thumb.
That's right. Good teaching often isn't about being knowledgeable of the subject matter. It's how you impart the teaching.
Which is the same as journalists.
Yes.
You know, there are many skills that you have to have.
Well, so what do you think are the key skills or traits you think are crucial for aspiring journalists in this time?
In this day and age, as it was and as it's always been, you've got to have an inquiring mind. You know, remember Julius Sumner Miller, well, I'm old enough, you know,
yes.
We were an inquiring mind. And, you know, I used to love that because it did for those who are listening, it was a TV show way back. Although clearly Rae is only hearing it secondhand because you're nowhere near as old as I am because you're just stunning. But this guy used to come on with different experiments, you know,
yes.
Why is it so? That was his thing. Why is it so? Well, that's the same as journalists, you know, in not so many different ways. Why is it so? Why is it happening? How did it happen? Who did it affect? What is the outcome? Where are we going? So you've got to have, first up, I think, an inquiring mind, and you've got to have the ability to connect. Because if you can't connect, well, actually, I'll hesitate. A good TV news journalist is what I should say, is what I'm talking about. Because there are many different facets of journalism. And these days, the wonderful thing is you can be just about anything you want to be in journalism. You can be a science journalist. You could be a fashion journalist. You can be a blogger. You can be whatever. But I'm talking traditional, the role of what I'd call a traditional journalist, so who goes out as a general news gatherer. So you've got to have a thick skin. You've got to have the ability to be tough.
A thick skin for what?
A thick skin for the amount of knockbacks you get, for the amount of subterfuge and, you know, fibs that you're often told by people who don't want the truth to come out. You have to be relentless in some ways, and you have to be relentless within a certain time frame because these days the news cycle's so fast, you don't have long. You've got to be analytical, and you've got to be able to impart everything in a very simply told, easily digestible format so that your audience actually take away something. And when I was doing media training, the interesting thing was you don't tell people 10 different things in a story because the ability for someone to remember that is limited. You tell them the one or two really, really important things you want them to take away.
Yeah.
And that takes telling a story in a shorter way is actually sometimes far more difficult than telling it in a long form.
Maybe think when you said about media training then, please, audience, don't be misconstrued that Steve was being trained, but he was the trainer in media. Maybe think about your influence, say, on corporations when they needed to risk manage their stories and you would go and help them do that. Can you give us a bit of insight?
Sure, there was
a whole other side of
it's a whole other side of the coin. So in corporate Australia, what struck me and still does. We've got these CEOs running multi-billion-dollar corporations, and Brad Banducci, poor man, is one of them, who was the CEO of Woolworths, who did the infamous now interview with Four Corners, where he got up and walked off and out of shot and said, "I'm sorry, that's it. We're going to call the interview." But that then became the story. Now, he must have had a squillion media advisors around him. He would have been prepped to the eyeballs, but for whatever reason, that moment of time, he just lost focus or something happened, or he genuinely thought that he could get away with that, and you can't. And the other thing that strikes me strangely is that corporate Australia don't often give the amount of training that they require, because I always put it to friends who are in whatever position you are in. Would you rather perform really well and have a 1% uplift in your share portfolio, or would you be a bad performer having had no training, nothing, and your share price drops 0.1%? If you're talking $1 billion corporation, we're talking big numbers. But that's just not corporations. That's in anything. And it strikes me as odd that people think these days they can be disingenuous. The biggest mistake people make generally, or corporations or anyone in that position, is they're not authentic. And sometimes the use of authenticity is overplayed. You've got to genuinely mean it. You can't just come out and say, "Oh, well, sorry," and then wander off. You've got to actually say it and back it up with, sorry, we've got now policies in place, we're reviewing, we're doing something. So crisis management is a really interesting space apart from media and presentation training, because once you're in a crisis, you're in. And you don't have a lot of time for thought or what's happening. And people need support. They need to be reassured from a company sense, a stakeholder sense, if it's in politics. Same as where you were. I saw it the other day, like your magnificent work, all that stuff with Beyond Blue. I mean, what a fantastic achievement and everything else, Rae, with that. But, you know, they're doing cutting edge stuff, but you're dealing with people's lives there. And,
well, yeah. Well, in fact, you know, Beyond Blue, their investment is in, you know, creating research and resources to get into the hands of as many people as possible. But it's interesting when you think about, when you're talking about social media, it made me think about, because I love social media. I without social media, I probably wouldn't be doing the work that I'm doing and getting that audience. But one particular person, based on that post that you were talking about, inboxed me, wasn't public, but basically said, hope you're happy, Rae. You're responsible pretty much for the rising rates of suicide through your work with Beyond Blue, and hope you're happy with the enormous paycheck that you take through that work, which could not be further from the truth. And I sat with that comment and I thought, how do I respond to that? Because I didn't want to react to it. Reaction inside of me was, how very dare you? I don't get paid a cent for that. Blah, blah. You've got no idea. And I thought, no, I'm not going to respond nor react to that, because that person probably has an experience of life where they're very inflamed. They may have had a personal experience. Me jumping into that was not going to be helpful.
Yeah, you've got to have, it's got to be a two-way street. You've got to have people who are willing to listen and be listened to. So in that case, it's probably, from my limited capacity, that's probably the right thing. I will say this, when I was running TT and news, the amount of people that would call and threaten or, you know, whatever, and be really inflamed. And I would always take that as, if you take the trouble to write, I will respond. And I cannot tell you the number of times, it was innumerable, I would either pick up the phone or just take the courtesy of a quick email saying, hi, I'm actually the person that runs the program. I hear you. Thank you for your comments. And I would always say, and I say this in life, constructive criticism is always welcome. When it becomes personal or vitriolic or anything else, I tend to go, that doesn't warrant a response. But if you're going to take the time to courteously engage, I'll absolutely engage. Right. And it always used to amaze people that, and when I'd call, I'd say, but aren't you busy? And I'd say, well, yes, I am, but I'm taking the time to call. But haven't you got stuff to do? I said, yes. Oh, well, thanks very much for calling, and we're fine now. So it's just, I think that's the thing. And that's why social media is great, Rae. And what social media has done is given people the opportunity to potentially be heard.
Yes. And practice their opinions as well. I love the ability to go and practice your opinions publicly, get feedback. And if that's in a really healthy environment where we're respecting each other's views and helping each other understand different perspectives, that's a very utopian environment. But it does happen. I see it a lot.
Look, this is a wonderful discussion. I'm sure people listening have a view, but where social media to me sometimes stumbles is the whole anonymity of it. There are things that people say online. They are using a pseudonym or something else, or anonymity under the cloak of darkness. They would never say to your face, and they gaslight and they do things. And it's sometimes human nature, showing its ugly face. But that to me is a downside. The upside is that you get the ability to see things very quickly. You get an overview. I mean, at the moment, I was totally engaged, and it sounds very War of the Worlds to me. In America at the moment, if you go online, there's this whole stream of stuff about UFOs or drones coming from everywhere and all over the place. And the government allegedly is not saying much at the moment. So what that's done is allow the gap to be filled, as it always is. And this is what I say to people in crises. If you don't say something, these days, the gap of the void will be filled. And it will not be often by people who have your best interests at heart or have a scintilla of the knowledge that you have. And therefore we end up with this whole overblown thing of conspiracy theories and, what starts as an anthill becomes a boulder by the end of the day. And the difficulty for journalists is that they are expected to wade through all that, make value judgment decisions on what purports to be truth. And sometimes it is masked as anything but that.
Yes. And whilst you might be supported by a network or an organisation that employs you, your name is still on that too.
Absolutely, and that's why I commend the work of journalists. A big shout out to Louise Milligan from Four Corners, who I was fortunate enough to hire into Channel 7 when I was news director. And then she went to Four Corners. She is genuinely a groundbreaking and very, very qualified and very solid investigative journalist who has the support of a massive organisation with the time and the resources to do that work that most cannot do these days. And we should, we often say, journalists have their own agenda. Her agenda is finding truth. I mean, Louise is a very, very good reporter and we need more of them.
Do you think on that we'll just say journalism, is probably more weighted towards male or female?
Oh, another great, coming out with some cracking, very difficult questions. Look, when I started, there were very few female journalists or producers. There were a lot of female PAs, so production assistants and doing those things. These days, it's tipped to me, I think, there are a huge amount of female reporters, producers, even news editors. The upper echelons can still, I think, be male dominant, which is what we've seen from work like Louise talking about the male culture within newsrooms. But I think it's changing. And again, I was lucky enough to call Jennifer Kite, who's the presenter at Channel 10, not only a work colleague, but a really good personal friend. She is absolutely unique in that she has this longevity, this respect, and she has the authority that comes with that. Now,
what is she doing now?
Jen is the mainline presenter at Channel 10 in Melbourne.
Oh, wow, there you go.
Yeah,
and
an all-round great person who, in an industry that's littered with the career corpses of many females and males, she's not only a survivor, but she's reached that position through not just luck. She's genuinely a great journalist, a good person. She never talks badly about anybody in an industry that's rife with, smear and innuendo.
Well, that's where we challenge that ageist piece, is that, not suggesting she's been around for a long time, but continues to be relevant. I think that's part of people will sell themselves out of any potential by saying, oh, I've just turned 40, so therefore I'm never going to get a job again. And you go, wow, okay, be anyone you want at any age and you can do it. And I think that, somebody like her who is a female in a traditionally male-dominated place who is still relevant now, turns that on its head.
Even more so, and the great thing with that is what I'd say to anybody aspiring to be a journalist these days is pick someone that you aspire to. You don't have to be a golem or a clone, but you do have to have something to aspire to say that's the kind of ethic, the kind of delivery, the kind of person, the kind of career that I want to have, and then work assiduously towards it, and take the opportunity, join peer group supported things, join professional organisations, take opportunity where it presents. And, you'll find that you'll get there. And the hardest thing, at the moment with all of the kids getting their ATRs and everything else is you see them, all the excitement, and then the penny drops of, oh, wow, what now?
Yeah. And is this the rest of my life? No, it's not. It just feels like it is.
Exactly right.
I think, it is that time of year as well, isn't it? Where all of that's happening. And that's a whole nother show that we could do. But just while we're talking about what's coming up next, I do want to remind anyone, we've talked about a lot of things today, but if any of our discussions today have brought up any uncomfortable feelings for listeners, please remember support is there. A few options. Now, we talk about options. These aren't necessarily going to work for you. But for crisis support, Lifeline, very good, 131114. If you phone and you get a person you don't connect with, hang up, try again until you get somebody you do. Use your brain. Suicide callback service, same thing, 1300 659 467. And emergency services, also very responsive, contrary to what the media tells us, 000. We have to have options when we're looking at what our support networks look like personally. Don't just rely on one thing. Don't wait until something happens before you decide to do that. Somebody's ringing in on the studio phone. Thank you for calling.
It's not to shut down.
But I will be back to you. Speaking of emergencies, I was at the doctor's surgery the other day with my granddaughter and Rory, my younger son. They were out in the waiting room, and I was in with my doctor, and the alarm starts going off, going, evacuate, evacuate. My doctor says, oh, it's just a drill. And I said, didn't say that. So the next thing I know, we're all out in the car park and the fire brigade's there. It's all within minutes. So it does work. So, Steve, where do you see the future of broadcast journalism in an era ruled by social media and streaming platforms? Just really succinctly.
Oh, really succinctly, I think there's a place for both, because not everybody has access to, we're talking some age limits here, not everybody has access to the wherewithal of being or wanting to be on social media. So the traditional news outlets, papers, radio, this beautiful program, mainline TV news, ABC, they all have a place, right? If you want to graze on other things, as I've said right at the start of the show, you should. But take the time potentially just to pull back a little bit and think, okay, how's it affecting me? What do I really want out of this? I'm going to challenge myself, and what I do for your listeners is challenge them. Not tell them, but challenge them. Yeah. Pick up something today after this program. Go somewhere else and have a listen to something that you may not have ordinarily done. Have a conversation with somebody that you may not ordinarily agree with. Take the time maybe to just have a look. There's a place for everything. The news is fracturing, but the demise of traditional news has been greatly overstated, and it's still vital to people who have that appointment viewing sometimes to sit down and go, this is just an hour or half an hour in my day. I can sit down and go, I don't know everything. I can't, but it'll just give me a little bit of a headline of what's been happening like we have today. Yeah.
I think that's one of my greatest takeaways from today in terms of we all play a role in supporting this amazing sector that brings us information every single day. And we don't think about the people that do that tirelessly. They put their lives on the line, their families on the line to bring us this, and we just consume it in a way that is just so thoughtless.
We are lucky to be in a place and a period of time where the information flow has never been greater, and we shouldn't take for granted. If you look at the fall of the Assad regime in Syria, where media was really restricted, we're lucky. And on that, it'd be great to flip the microphones in the new year sometime, if I have permission, and actually sit in that side of the seat and ask you about your incredible journey, of which I know a little, but I will research a lot.
Wow.
And I think your audience would be absolutely extraordinarily entertained and interested in the very rich and very meaningful career that you've crafted for yourself and others.
I'm extremely blown away and honoured, and I would love to flip that around, and especially to be interviewed by somebody as accomplished as you. And I know your level of homework.
I'll call Tim Watson for some tips.
Can he come in, please? But that would be absolutely amazing. And I was just thinking, we were talking about words today, and some of the words that you've shown me. When I left home and school at a very young age for reasons that we will discuss in this interview. But one of the first things I did, because I didn't have an education, I started reading the dictionary, and I started learning words. And the first word that I learned that I loved the taste of it, I loved the sound of it, was penultimate.
Penultimate.
One before the last.
Wow, that is a very strong word.
Yes. So there's a little bit of an insight on things that you can find out about me.
I will make that my starting point, but it won't be the finishing point.
The penultimate. Thank you. I let's book that in after we get off air. Now, I'm going to be back in 2025 on the 19th of January, and my very special guest is a man by the name of Mark Brooks from the UK. He's an award-winning senior policy and communications advisor on men's health, so I know him very well through my work on global action on men's health. We're based in London, but we work with all countries of the world, especially around policy development, and he has been very involved and instrumental in the recent announcement of a men's health strategy in the UK, which should be published next year. And this is really big news because it will be only the 8th men's health strategy in the world that has been written. So that's alongside Australia. We're very proud to have one. Doesn't have money attached to it here in Australia yet, but Ireland, Iran, Brazil, Malaysia, Mongolia, and South Africa are other countries that have a men's health policy. So to get that over the line in the UK was very big news, and Mark played a role in that. So I'm going to be really keen to sit with him. In fact, we'll be doing it obviously over the communications channel, being in the UK. So that's exciting.
That is exciting. It's also damning. Just listening to you say that's one of only 8, I have many things to ask you
yes.
when we swap mics.
But you think about it, here in Australia we don't have a minister for men's health, never have had one. Why? Given the challenges that are faced by men, if you just thought of things about suicide, mostly men, workplace deaths, 95% of workplace deaths are men here in Australia and around the world. What are we doing about that? There's nothing. So why wouldn't we be putting things in place to minimise the risk? Because if you don't care about men, care about the people that they're leaving.
Yeah.
And that's pretty simple. So based on that very somber piece.
Let's bring it up. I didn't get to put in one of my bands, my favourite band probably of all time, with my best mate, because you need to have a best mate who's also a drummer, Rick Hawkins, and his son have got this band called Grasshole. So it's not on my list, and it should have been, because Ken Oath's Conundrum is my favourite track. But Ken Oath it's fantastic, so I urge people to do that too. But the reason I mention Rick is I never had a brother.
Yeah.
But I was fortunate that I have Rick, and if I did have a brother, Rick would be it.
Wow.
That's so these are the things that you think of as your life journey goes through.
Yeah. Wonder if Ricky's listening in today.
Well, I'll find out.
Speaking of listening in, we are waiting for the divine Paula Hogg. She's coming up next on 3WBC, rolling out an entire lazy Sunday afternoon of music and banter. She could have been the person that was phoning in to say she's not turning up. Who knows? We're going to have to sit here for the next few hours. Steve Carey, thank you for joining us today on 3WBC and sharing your incredible experiences and remarkable contributions to the media and beyond now.
Thanks for having me.
Today's interview is yet another example of your outstanding talent, especially in the sphere of radio, and it's been an absolute delight to celebrate you. I'd also like to extend gratitude to all the wonderful guests and listeners for their contributions and ongoing support throughout the year. Without your stories, well, I wouldn't even have a show. I'd just be talking about myself. But I'm also very happy to share that all shows, again, are available for listeners anytime, anywhere on Spotify, iHeartRadio, Apple Podcasts, and their original home on YouTube. Finally, though, as we navigate the festive season, I'd like to wish everyone a safe, joyful and meaningful time. And while this time of the year is one of celebration for many, we know it can also be challenging. Please take care of yourself, check in with those around you, and be mindful of how your words and actions may impact others. That's code for be kind, be caring, and don't be a beep.
It's a family-friendly program. So.
That's right. But we do look forward to welcoming you back here on the 19th of January in 2025. Can you believe we're saying that?
No.
And until then, stay safe. We have one song to send us out on, Steve, which is...
What's the clue?
There's no clue. Oh. The clue is that we're closing the show.
Oh, Closing Time by the Semisonic. And I should say that this is also very important to me because it reminds me so much of my beautiful partner and wife, Inika, who is
sitting
the
here
reason
right now.
She's here, my support person, which is great. And I love it a bit. It's fantastic. And, and the reason I'm able to live the way I do is because I've got the support of her.
Well, she has also been she was my friend before I became friends with you. And so she's also very dear to me as well. And she's Inika tinkles. She's like, if you're going to relate Christmas to Inika, she's sparkly and she tinkles because she's light, impactful, and just makes you feel good.
Closing time.
He goes. Okay, we're going. We're out. We're out of here.
Thank you so much. That was a hoot.